think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Art of ARC, Tips for Drafting and Submitting a Brownfields Grant Application in Fiscal Year 2025. My name is Brooklyn James. I'm with the U.S. EPA Region 9 Brownfields and Land Revitalization team. I'm joined here with my colleagues from EPA Brownfields, the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and the Sierra Institute for Community and Environment. Okay, just starting off with a couple of housekeeping items. Here's our agenda. Our presentation portion hopefully will be pretty brief today, but we're going to go over changes to the Notice of Funding Opportunity, what's different from last year's. We're going to take a look at some of the important data tools that you can use for your application. I'll have some specific notes for nonprofit applicants as well as cleanup grant applicants. Then we'll head into Devin Rainwater, who will give a little bit of information about the Center for Creative Land Recycling and the services that they can provide. And then we'll jump into a discussion and a Q&A where we'll discuss any questions that we receive from you all in the chat. So a few Zoom reminders. First of all, please keep your microphone muted during the presentations. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat. We'll get to them during the Q&A. And just a reminder to everybody, the slides and recording, we are recording this presentation, will be posted on our website afterwards for anyone who wasn't able to attend live. So quick disclaimer that I want to mention, since our solicitations are currently open, EPA personnel may respond to questions regarding threshold criteria, administrative issues related to submitting your grant application, and requests for clarification on the announcement specifically, but we cannot meet with individual applicants to discuss draft applications, provide informal comments on those applications, or give advice to applicants on how to respond to narrative and ranking criteria. However, the Center for Creative Land Recycling personnel can review and provide comments on draft applications, including responses to the narrative and ranking criteria. So, just in case you were not able to tune into OBLR's webinars on the different grant types and the narrative and ranking criteria, I wanted to just do a really quick overview of the different grants that we're offering this round, starting with our assessment grants. So we have our community-wide assessment grant. Under this grant, you can do an inventory of brownfields in your community. You could do phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments, community engagement and community outreach, as well as cleanup and reuse planning. And these grants go up to $500,000. Similarly, we have a community-wide assessment for states and tribes. You can do the same activities under this grant, but this grant goes up to $2 million. We also have our assessment coalition, which again has the same activities. This one is for up to 1.2 million. The difference here is that there will be one lead member who will be the one to apply for the grant, and 2 to 4 non-lead partners that may not have the capacity to apply for their own grant, all working together towards the same goal of revitalizing brownfields in a particular target area. Next, we have our cleanup grants. And under this, you can do the actual remediation of contamination. You could do reuse planning, and it can cover regulatory oversight fees. We are doing 3 pools of funding for this grant type: a $500,000, a $2 million, and a $4 million. Some things to note for the cleanup grant is that if you are the applicant, you must be the sole owner of the site. The site has to have a completed phase 2 environmental site assessment or equivalent report, and you cannot be considered the responsible party for contamination. Lastly, we are offering the revolving loan fund this year, which this is funding to support brownfields cleanups with low or no interest loans and subgrants. So the grant amount for this is $1 million, but you have the opportunity to get supplemental funding over the years. And an applicant that applies for an RLF must be able to manage loans and subgrants. But under this one is basically the only opportunity where privately owned sites can receive loans for brownfields remediations in our program. Lastly, I wanted to mention that because of the bipartisan infrastructure law funding that's currently available, we are not requiring cost shares on any of our grants. And this bill funding is only available for this cycle and the next one. And after that, cost shares will likely return to these grants. Okay, now I'm going to just briefly touch on the changes to the NOFO that are different from last year. These are just paraphrased, very much simplified. So if you want to see the details, please visit this link I have in the bottom that has the full summary of all the changes. But to start off, we're not offering multi-purpose grants this round. The requirements for tribes to follow federal procurement guidelines has changed. Entities that were awarded a community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes in fiscal year 2022 to 2024 are not eligible to apply for coalition or community-wide assessment grants in FY25. Drawdown requirements must be met by October 1st, 2024. And community-wide assessment grants for state and tribe applicants must have drawn down 60%. This was reduced from 70% last year. Coalition applicants must have at least one non-lead member who has never had a MARC grant. And there will be a new section for cleanup applicants to demonstrate eligibility for a site with hazardous building materials that have not been released to the outdoors. So big red box here, applications are due November 14th by the end of the day Eastern time. So keep that in mind. Okay, so in your application, the narrative section, you will be asked to describe your community's needs. And we wanted to share with you some of the tools that can help you get that data associated with demographics, health, welfare, environmental factors. For example, things like incidence of disease, asthma and cancer rates, different economic statuses like low income or unemployment rates, environmental concerns like if there's a number of Superfund sites near your community, USTs in the ground, wildfire risk, and other data for at-risk populations such as like the elderly and the youth. So I wanted to share two of these data tools. The first one is the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. We call it CJUST because we love acronyms. But this identifies different census tracts as being either disadvantaged or not disadvantaged based on 8 different indicators of burden. So essentially, if you go to a census tract or your community and at least more than one of these burdens have crossed a threshold of a certain percentile, then this community would be identified as disadvantaged. This is the CJUST tool. We also have EJ Screen over here on the right. So this presents the data a little differently. It's more of a continuum of burden and vulnerability ratings. The results are in the form of percentiles, rather than CJUST is a binary yes or no, whether or not it's identified as disadvantaged. But this example here for EJ Screen is for underground storage tanks. So the red areas have 95 to 100% percentile for the amount of underground storage tanks in that area. You can see there's a cluster of them. So this would indicate a more underserved area in this category. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention here is that some rural communities have experienced difficulty finding data that's specific enough to their areas. When you're way out in rural areas, sometimes we don't have as much data available. So we encourage those applicants to get a little creative with how you find this data. You can use county data or you can use regional data to demonstrate what the community needs are as well. So this is more for you to be able to access afterwards when you have access to the slides, but just wanted to provide some more examples of data tools that you can use in writing your application in the target area and priority site description or the community needs and sensitive population information. Okay, now I wanted to note a few things for our nonprofit applicants. So when you are applying, EPA will need to evaluate the capability of your organization to handle federal funds in this large amount award. So some of the things that we're going to take a look at are your financial systems, your quality management systems, history of performance, reports from any previous audits, if there were any, and then just the overall ability to implement all of the regulatory requirements that we have under our grants. And then if your application was selected for an award prior to being able to receive that award, we'll ask you to submit this form that I have a little screen grab of here to kind of get some more specifics about your systems in your nonprofit. And we can always implement different pre-award or special conditions that allow more time for you to get into compliance with your nonprofit certification status. This is, again, just a super brief overview. If you want more details on pre-award compliance for nonprofits, I have it linked down here at the bottom. Okay, next I'm going to talk to the cleanup grant applicants. So if everybody else just wants to close your eyes for a minute, feel free, but I'm going to go into a little bit of the weeds here just for a minute. So I want to talk about some of the eligibility requirements for cleanup grant applicants. Number one, if you're an applicant, you have to be the sole owner of the site. And as the owner, you have to be exempt from CERCLA liability, or you cannot be the responsible party for the contamination at the site. Also, you have to be an eligible entity, which for our grants is a state entity, tribal government, local government, nonprofits, qualified community development agencies. And if you are a nonprofit, you have to be able to attach your tax exempt status or your 501c3 or 4 status to your application. Lisa Hanusiak, who is on our panel today, is our lead for any eligibility questions. So please send her an email if you have any specific questions about your site. Next, I want to talk about the different requirements that you have to have in order to apply. And this slide's going to get a little wordy, so I'm going to just pop them up one at a time. First of all, the site needs to have a completed phase 2 environmental site assessment or equivalent report. There also needs to be a draft analysis of brownfields cleanup alternative report. This report takes a look at the different alternatives that you have for cleanup options and compares them on different scales. You'll also need to get a letter from a state or environmental tribal authority, ensuring that the site is either sufficiently characterized or will be sufficiently characterized, and what the status is of the site in regards to if it is involved in a voluntary response program or not. Then you must release a community notification ad that can be no later than 14 days before when the application is due, which again is the 14th. So essentially by November 1st, this community ad must go out with your draft application and your draft ABCA for comments. And then you'll need to host a public meeting where you can discuss and consider comments from the public on your cleanup grant application and your draft ABCA. And then you'll have to be able to demonstrate how this feedback was considered and taken into your application. Okay, with that, I'm going to pass it over to Devin Rainwater. Mute myself.
Thank you so much, Brooklyn, for sharing that really great summary of what awards are out right now, or what grants are out right now, and the requirements to getting those grants. So I'm here to kind of represent the Center for Creative Land Recycling, which is the technical assistance to brownfields or TAB provider for EPA regions 9 and 10. So we are here to provide free technical assistance to communities, municipalities, and nonprofits that are navigating brownfield reuse, and that are, if you're considering applying for these grants, we can absolutely support you through that process. And, a major part of the land reuse process is identifying and acquiring funding for site assessment and cleanup. So we will help you through that part of the process. And that can look like a variety of different things, and some of those are listed here. So we can support you in planning your narrative approach and telling your story in your application. We can support you in engaging partners and stakeholders, and strategizing community engagement, and even hosting visioning workshops to engage with community members and ideas for reuse. The mapping tools that Brooklyn discussed earlier, we can assist you in navigating those tools to understand what information to include in your application, what the relevant community data is for your story, to really show the narrative of your community. And we can also connect you with applicants that have been successful in this process, and share past successful grant applications that will really help you understand how to approach these grants. Finally, I want to highlight that we can provide a thorough review of your draft ARC application and do as many rounds of edits as time allows. So I'll talk about that on the next slide too. So with our draft review, you'll get two things back. You'll get your original draft with detailed comments and red lines to support the improvement of your draft. And you'll also receive a completed rubric like the one that you see here. So this rubric breaks down each component of the application guidelines and provides you with a score from 1 to 3. A 1 is great, things are looking really good, while a 3 shows you that you need some improvements on that area. And we're happy to meet with you to discuss the scores that you get back on the rubric from us and also the comments on your draft. And we really want to get you to success and see lots of green ones on your rubric. But this is the kind of detail that you can expect from us with our review, and you can typically see a draft returned within a few days. So next slide. In addition to our review services, I'd also like to share these resources that we provide to everyone taking on an EPA Brownfields grant. And so Ignacio if you can share these resources in the chat so that you can follow along with the links, that would be great. And so first on the list, of course, it's important to stay aware of what's happening on EPA's MARC webpage to see the guidelines, the FAQs, and take note of upcoming events and informative webinars. Second here, we have CCLR has an excellent webpage that can get you started in planning your application. And this is a really great place to start because on that same page, you will see a link to past successful EPA MARC applications. And this is just a really great thing to look through to get a sense of what EPA is expecting, what projects are likely to be awarded, and kind of how you want to approach your narrative. You can also view past CCLR events, including last year's webinar on how to write a successful application. And this was a MAC year, so it only covers multipurpose assessment and cleanup grants. And you can also take a look at this year's webinar all about writing a cleanup grant application where Ignacio takes you through the process, and that's Mr. Cleanup. That's our webinar. The last link here provides information just on the TAB program in general and lists other providers. So if you happen to be outside of Region 9 or 10, you can find your TAB provider on that link. And also on the right side of the slide, you can see that we have an upcoming resource coming out of CCLR and Kansas State University, which will provide detailed, helpful hints and information at each part of the applications for each application. So definitely subscribe to CCLR's newsletter to stay up to date on that resource coming out. And then we can go to the next slide. So CCLR also does more than just grant review, kind of like I touched on an earlier slide. We can provide free technical assistance at every step of your project. So we offer trainings and specialized resources. We can support you in developing a redevelopment plan or a roadmap of next steps, assist you in identifying the right funding for your project, provide remediation support, and we can assist you with stakeholder and community engagement. And then the next slide. So here's this year's grant review team from CCLR, and we're super excited to look over your draft applications and support your success. So you can schedule a technical assistance call with us if you'd like to chat one-on-one, or you can subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date on events and deadlines. And if you would like us to review your application, you don't need to set up a meeting if you don't want to, but you just need to send us your draft in Word document format to the email address that's on the screen there, markreview@cclr.org, and label your draft as applicant name, state, grant type with review request. And that naming convention will be on the next slide as well. But I would also like to say, EPA Brownfields grants are very competitive. And last year, 75% of the applications that CCLR reviewed were awarded. And that was $14 million in funding for Regions 9 and 10. So it's definitely something that can really help you in getting awarded with these grants. And if you are a consultant and you're sending CCLR an application on behalf of an applicant, please include the applicant's contact information and CC the applicant in your email. We work directly with communities, nonprofits, and municipalities, so we need to work with the applicant themselves as well. And if you would like to receive 2 or more rounds of edits on your application, please get your drafts to us by Friday, November 1st, so that that can give us enough time to review your application as many times as you need, potentially meet with you if you'd like to talk through our comments. And also, applications will be reviewed on a first come, first serve basis. So with that, that's everything to know about CCLR. I will pass it over to Che to share his experience. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Devin. My name's Che, and I work for the Sierra Institute for Community and Environment. We are a nonprofit up in Plumas County, California, and we have been involved with some EPA Brownfields grants for over 10 years at this point, all surrounding one site and one project. And I can give a brief overview of what it's been. So basically, the Sierra Institute works on kind of the full picture of improving life in the rural forested regions, well, around us, but really our work has implications nationally, and we do that on both with environmental work and economic revitalization. And our Brownfields grant kind of exemplifies doing both at the same time, because a lot of our work in our area, it's really forested, and we have undergone multiple catastrophic wildfires. And so it is, a lot of our work surrounds thinning forests and doing forest resilience work. And one of the bottlenecks that we identified early on is not having a place to take waste wood out of the forest from the projects that we plan and consume it, and better yet, actually produce enough value from it to pay for the expensive process of processing wood. And so that's what our EPA project has been about, is getting a site ready to be able to house facilities that can do that work. And so we call it it's in our, where we're based is a valley called Indian Valley, and it is the Indian Valley Wood Products Campus. It historically, you can see in these pictures what the site used to be. Used to be a huge sawmill back through the 1900s, went and provided a ton of jobs for the area. And throughout the 1900s, bunch of factors went into the shutting down of sawmills all over our region. And so this site was left basically vacant with now no economic activity going on, and was left with some contamination from the practices, of last century. And so our Brownfields journey kind of started with getting assessment grants to be able to just determine what the site had on it, whether it was even feasible to revitalize it for our purposes, and then went into cleanup work. And we've been involved with at least 4 separate cleanup grants to target specific areas of the site and do specific work. And throughout it, we've successfully been able to provide a place that's now viable to build on and create the economic activity around forest restoration work that has been our goals. So you can see pictured here a sawmill that we were able to launch and get going in partnership with some local contractors and loggers. And this sawmill was able to actually take in logs from the Dixie Fire, which was a huge fire that burned down actually the biggest town in our little area here. We were able to take logs salvaged from that fire, bring them to our site, because it was now, this wouldn't have been possible prior to our EPA projects. but now we had a viable site to receive logs and actually generate some value from them in using lumber. And we have much more plans involving cross-laminated timber and even bioenergy production in the form of hydrogen fuel. We have other things planned for this site, and so yeah, I'm happy to talk about our process with the EPA grants, because that is what has made all of this happen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jay, for sharing about your project. So now we're going to kind of shift gears into a little bit of a discussion. So hopefully you can see all of our panelists here. Um, the last person who has not been introduced is Ignacio from the Center for Creative Land Recycling. He's here as well to answer some questions, and we're kind of just going to go through some of the frequently asked questions that we get. I'm going to go over a few of those, and then we'll open it up to the questions we've received in the chat, and we'll pass those to our panelists and hear some different perspectives. So the first thing I kind of wanted to ask, maybe C Clear can start on this one. If there's any particular tips that you have for anybody interested in applying for an EPA Brownfields grant.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. This is Ignacio. Tips. Well, there's lots. You should be drafting your grant right now, but even before you start putting pencil to paper, there are many things you can do. You can be sure to do your SAM and grants.gov credentials so that you don't run into any problems when it's time to submit. When you actually start looking at the questions, answer them directly. A lot of folks have gone through past applications and kind of copied what they had there, and they actually miss answering the questions. You have to be literal. Answer what EPA has in the sheet and in the helpful hints. And once you get that done, and where applicable, use numbers, use statistics, be as specific as possible. Don't be generic, because if you're generic, the EPA reviewer, the EPA reviewers probably sees the same generic responses from 90% of people. That makes it very difficult for them to review. So be as specific as possible. We do have that helpful hints that we will be able to share. And the helpful hints actually includes tips on answering each question and tips of where to get data or metrics to answer this. So between the helpful hints and the FAQs and your efforts, reaching out to your community, you should be able to do everything. Pretty much 99% of your work. If you don't do that before sending it to us, then stop, do that first, and then send us your draft application.
Great, thank you. I'm wondering if, Che, you have any perspective from the Sierra Institute's side, since the Sierra Institute has applied for many grants over the years, if any tips come to mind for writing or submitting your application.
Yeah, I would say definitely it makes really don't hold back on getting to know your community. I mean, you're part of your community, so you probably that's a given, but really dive into the unique things that make your community, and connect that to the project that you want to do. I think that would help to what Ignacio was talking about not being generic in your responses.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm wondering if, as a super rural community, there was any particular obstacles you faced in applying for the grants.
Yeah, and as you mentioned in the slideshow earlier, it's difficult to find data in depending on how rural of an area you're in. We definitely suffer from that. We have for a long time, and it might be ongoing, that rural forested there was no rural forested community that was considered disadvantaged, even though we know very well that many of the communities around here are extremely disadvantaged with really high unemployment rates, really high poverty. And so we've actually had to do a lot of our own research and publish our own findings on how disadvantaged our communities are. But also kind of like I was saying earlier, if you're able to just put together a compelling story, even and use anecdotal information, that can be helpful as well.
Yeah, definitely. Ignacio, C. Clear, Devin, do you guys have anything to add to that?
Yes, depending on the question you have, and again, if you've searched the data sources that will be on the helpful hints, and if you're still having difficulty, talk to some recognized experts in your area or authorities. For instance, if you need health data, you can't find it, form your questions and send your questions to the health officer, or perhaps go to the rural hospital and chat with the folks there, uh, or maybe a college professor at the community college. Find experts who will have credibility with the EPA reviewer. I don't know that EPA will fact check them, but no one really tries to make up things in these grant applications. They can be confirmed or not. But those are the things that I would do if you're having a hard time getting information. Now, getting that information though from city officials, you have to be careful as well because it's self-serving. So you want to find a neutral party for that expertise.
Okay, great. Yeah, those are really helpful suggestions. I think something too that's important is if you're struggling with finding data for your community, explain that in your application. I mean, explore the tools that are out there and see if there's options, but in the absence of the data, explain, what you're using instead and why. Like we want to hear those stories, those anecdotes, those all matter too, as well as the data.
Yes, and to add to that, not just for the data, but there's a section there about community participation and roles. You're going to have, in many rural communities, you have different people wearing different hats. Again, you have to explain that. If you don't really have what are considered grassroots organizations or nonprofits in rural areas, but your electeds or community folks or the school represent those interests, uh, include them and explain why that is the case.
Awesome, thank you. So, shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to talk some more about the assessment grants and what are some eligible tasks or activities that you can do under the assessment grant that can help get your community towards addressing these brownfields. I'll direct this question to Lisa from EPA first.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for participating in our webinar today. And for assessment grants, the purpose is to enable communities to compile an inventory of brownfield sites, to help with prioritizing sites, maybe based on potential for redevelopment or concerns from the community, whatever the community's needs are. The assessment grants also enable area-wide planning, reuse planning, cleanup planning. And one of the great things about assessment grants is that the funding can be used to assess both public and privately owned properties. So that's not the case for some of our other grants that do not allow the use of public funds on private, for example, for cleanups. But it's pretty straightforward. The other thing is you can do community engagement, which is a pretty important component of our assessment grants, and we encourage that to really help guide the project and direct it toward the community's benefit.
So Lisa, are there any opportunities for privately held sites to get cleanup funding?
Yes, good question, Brooklyn. So you, as a private entity, you are not eligible to apply for a cleanup grant. However, if there is a revolving loan fund grant that covers your area, you would be eligible potentially to get a loan from the entity that has a revolving loan fund grant. And that funding can be used then to clean up the site. The idea is the funding gets repaid and then it gets revolved, used for future work after it's repaid.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to jump over to questions about the cost share requirements. So currently we have the bill funding. How much longer is that expected to be available, and what do we know as of right now is going to happen after that expires?
Well, so we do have the bill funding, which is the bipartisan infrastructure law, which provided a lot of additional funding to the EPA Brownfields program in addition to other federal programs. And we have that funding available for the next 2 years. So for this particular grant cycle, and then for the grant cycle next year. And the wonderful thing is it took away the 20% cost share requirement that was part of cleanup grants and revolving loan fund grants. So there's no cost share requirement. We don't know, honestly, what's going to happen after 2 years, but we suspect it'll go back to the way it was before we had the bipartisan infrastructure law funding. So I would think that folks should kind of anticipate that that might be the case. And if you're at all thinking about applying for cleanup or revolving loan fund or multi-purpose grant funding next year, this is the time to do it. Take advantage.
Yes, that's a good point. And for those who really are trying to take advantage and submit something this year, we did touch upon this earlier, but I wanted to ask Ignacio, if people want feedback on their draft applications, what's the process for them to get that?
As Devin mentioned, just send it to that email address, markreview@cclr.org. A call could be useful, but sometimes having that background information, not having that background information helps, because we're like all the EPA reviewers, the people who will be reviewing this are going into your community cold turkey. So the more descriptive your grant is without that initial intro, the better. And send it as soon as you can. We've already reviewed 3 drafts. So, and returned them for comments already. So send them in. We just have a thick skin. We use what we call tough love. So sometimes in an effort to be brief, we don't say please or things like that, but we mean well, and we want you to have the best chance at getting these grants written. So to the point, and our comments are to the point as well.
Awesome. Thank you. So lastly, before we switch over to doing questions from the audience and the attendants here, I wanted to ask Lisa, can you kind of define what sort of questions EPA can answer during open solicitation versus what questions are better to be directed towards CCLR?
You bet. Thank you for asking, Brooklyn. And unfortunately, we are kind of limited when the request for applications comes out. EPA staff, we can answer general questions about the request for applications and the process. We can talk about administrative issues or submitting applications. And then we can also respond to questions about site or applicant or activity eligibility for the various grants. But with respect to any specific guidance about your project, or for example, questions on how to respond to specific criteria in the request for applications, those are the kinds of project-specific questions that you should direct to CCLR, because we are prohibited from providing an advantage to any specific applicant by responding to project-specific questions.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so now we are going to transition to looking at some of the questions that we got in the chat. So give me just a second here. I will pull that up. Okay, so one of the questions that we got is, how can an entity be the sole owner? This is regarding cleanup grant program. So how can an entity be the sole owner but not be included on DTSC order as a responsible party? I think this might be an okay question for EPA to answer.
Can you repeat? I'm not sure if I understand the question. Let me see
Yeah.
if I can pull it up and see it written. Maybe it'll make more sense to me.
Sure. I think this might have come to me as a direct message, but I'll try to repeat it again. How can an entity be a sole owner of a site but not considered the responsible party? Like, in what case does that happen?
Well, I guess if you acquired the property, for example, after the release of contamination and there's a defense to liability, that would be potentially one way. I would say, though, a lot of these questions that we get about site eligibility are very site specific. And if you have more details so that we could really drill down to the specific situation in your case, I'd be happy to talk to you offline about it more to get a better understanding. And then I could also check in if I need to with our legal staff, because sometimes I need backup support. I'm not an attorney.
Okay, great. And we'll have our contact information available at the end. So that will show our emails, and you can send us an email about your specific questions about eligibility. EPA can answer those. So moving over to another question. This is a really good one. If a project is not in a disadvantaged census tract, but the adjacent census tracts are, will points still be awarded for community need in the grant application? So either CCLR or EPA, think about it for a second, or if somebody has a response.
Yes, I'll take
that one.
Oh,
kind of
ahead.
treads the line.
Yeah.
I'm going to try not to get myself in trouble, but I can say that it's not required that the applicant is in a disadvantaged community based on, the CGES tool or other tools. But if there is a connect, basically you need to tell a story and connect how, for example, the community that is disadvantaged would benefit from work that you're trying to do in the area where the work is proposed. I think that's a general enough response, so I'm not in trouble. Let me hand it over to you, Ignacio.
Right. And again, the guidelines kind of shift every year. So every year I have to think about what the right answer is. Essentially, you have a target area, and then you have your sites. And many applicants confuse the two. But what you try to do is find the information through CGES or EJ screen, or if you're in California, Calenviro screen, or other measures to show that your community is disadvantaged in some way. That is for both the target area and the site that is hopefully in that target area. And again, your target area can be comprised of many census tracts. For small cities, the target area could be the entire city. But for big cities, that could be a few census tracts. And some applicants are strategic in which census tracts they include in their grant application. And they try to find census tracts that are deemed disadvantaged under some kind of measure. But in any case, you have your sites should be in the target area, whether the target area is a census tract and or a no, say what was I say? Yeah, the site should be in a census tract that is disadvantaged. So that's kind of the simple response there, and of course there are many different situations. So for that kind, for a deeper response, I think we need to have a conversation.
Great. Thank you both. I'm going to scroll down a little to another question. This one's a little lengthy, but I think it's a good one to address. I'll read it here, but this was sent by Regina around 1:33 if others want to pull it up and read it along. So it says, we are a school, nonprofit, hoping to purchase a lot right next door to us that is a brownfield site. We are not able to purchase unless we were to be awarded a grant. Does this mean that if we wanted a cleanup grant currently owned by Caltrans, we would not be able to apply unless we ask the owner to be the applicant? Is there another grant that we can use to clean up as not the current owner?
Well, part of that's an eligibility question, and you can't apply for a cleanup grant if you're not an eligible property owner. So you have to own it, and the site has to be eligible.
Exactly. You unfortunately,
Yes.
you do need to be the site owner to access the cleanup funding.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's see.
There was an earlier question here. Let's see, from Michael, I think it was. Okay, Michael, did we answer Michael's question already? Okay, yeah, Michael's question is if a project site is not in a disadvantaged census tract. I think we answered this kind of, sort of.
Yes. Yeah. There was another question from Michael later down in the chat that says, can community-wide assessment grants be used for reuse planning of a specific site, or do these grants need to be area-wide? I think that's a good one for Lisa.
Yeah, you can certainly use it as long as it's an eligible site. And you've checked in with EPA to confirm that it is eligible under the grant. You could do site-specific reuse for cleanup planning.
Does C-Claire want to add anything to that?
No, yeah, I mean, it's you can do site-specific, I mean, individual sites or area-wide assessments and or reuse planning under an assessment grant.
Yeah, great. Scrolling down to the next question, we have another about applying for a cleanup grant. Do you have to have an estimate for demolition of a former food production factory? We have completed our environmental assessments. Does the site have to be classified as a brownfield based on EPA's definition?
Well, it does need to be a brownfield site, but the definition is really broad. It's any site that has the potential or actual contamination that's hindering the site reuse and redevelopment. So it's a really low bar. It's really easy to identify a site as a brownfield site. So assuming there's some sort of either actual contamination or perceived contamination, and that situation is hindering redevelopment, it would be considered a brownfield site. And then, barring any other sort of site eligibility concerns, which we could always vet with you specifically, it would hopefully be eligible.
One thing I will mention is that demolition is unfortunately not an eligible activity under any of our grant opportunities.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up, Brooklyn. It could potentially be part of a cleanup if, for example, there's, I'm going to use hazardous building materials as an example. If there is a cleanup option that's most effective that would include demolition in addition to abating the hazardous building materials, then potentially it could be included. But demolition alone is not an eligible activity under our brownfields grants.
Yes, thank you for that clarification.
Actually, I'd like to kind of discuss, kind of bring this further, this topic further on lead and asbestos. So I'm going to ask a question, Lisa, and
Yep.
you can tell me whether it's eligible or not, or you can answer it or not. So many cities have had these long vacant sites. They've held them and have done nothing to them, kind of holding that maybe they fenced it. And let's say the lead and asbestos, with sampling, they found lead and asbestos on the soil, not just in the building. Will they now, because of the new circular, the revisions this year, would they be responsible parties? And if so, can they still clean up the building for lead and asbestos and just be responsible for the soil cleanup?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ignacio. And the way we're looking at hazardous building materials currently is that as long as the materials have not been released into the environment, the outside environment, that the hazardous building materials are contained within the structure, that's considered not to be a release to the environment. So I would say, again, in any case, it's always good to get our opinion on a site-specific basis so that we could, ask questions to confirm. But what we're really looking at is, as long as there's not a release to the outside environment, the site would be eligible potentially.
All right. So for any of you folks who have buildings that have lead and asbestos and you sampled the soil and there may be contamination there from the building, contact Lisa at ASAP.
Yes. Okay, so I think I've addressed all the questions in the chat. Please let me know if I missed one because we do have about 6 minutes left. Also, if anybody else has more questions, feel free to add them in the chat.
There's a question here in our docket of other questions, is that does EPA have a recommended mapping software for the optional map in the, that comes with the, I guess, the threshold, or the non-narrative portion of the grant?
That's a good question. This is the first year that grant applicants are given the opportunity to provide that kind of supplemental information. And I would say we do not have a recommendation. Is that accurate, Brooklyn? Or have you heard of any recommendation?
Not personally.
Yeah, I think no, that it's an option that you can use, and really whatever would best help supplement or tell the story that you're trying to present to demonstrate to EPA why there's a concern in the community and why the grant would help to address that concern. Whatever would best support that narrative would be the tool to choose. So sorry, I can't be more specific. Maybe CCLR, based on some of the visualizations, have some recommendations.
Well, yeah, my understanding is that it just helps the reviewer figure out where in the world your site is. And so what I would suggest is go on any mapping, online mapping program, Google Maps, or I don't know what other mapping software there is. Apple, I guess, has one. Get a screenshot of the vicinity. So find the major road or boundaries, and get a screenshot of that, and then zoom into your site, get a screenshot of that, and then put it on a graphic software, like you can do it in PowerPoint, and just put in the major identifiers like the highway or the river, or the bay or the water body or landmarks, and just mark it up and just use that. It gives just anything to basically show the EPA where your site is, because the reviewers are from all over the country. You're not going to get a reviewer from region 9 or 10. I mean, if you're region 9, you probably won't get one from region 9. So you're going to have folks from the East Coast reviewing this. So it helps them visualize at least where the site is.
Great. Thank you so much. We have about 3 minutes left, so if anybody else has a last minute question, feel free to put it in the chat or come off mute if that's easier for you. Otherwise, I have put up our contact information. So these are just the speakers who were involved today. We do have other EPA representatives and other CCLR representatives that can help you as well. But feel free to reach out to anybody here if you have specific questions, and we'll make sure to get you to the right person to answer those questions. Any last minute thoughts from any of our panelists?
Sure. Community-wide assessments tend to be the most competitive. So if you're a smaller community and you have other small communities within your county that need the same kind of assistance, go to your county and figure out if the county can be a lead coalition applicant. Your chances are much better. The coalitions have a higher batting average, or go to your state. States even have higher chances of getting these grants. For cleanups, get your meeting scheduled right away. It's already, and if you're in California, check in with your regulator, because the review periods might be too long for you to make the deadline. It pushes it. It makes your meeting. Some local agencies require a 30-day notice, and the EPA has a minimum of 14 days. But if your regulator requires more, then you certainly want to plan for that. So those are two biggies there.
Thanks, Ignacio.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say that if you're a nonprofit and you're struggling with any of the grant administration or finance stuff, I guess this would be after you get a grant. Feel free to reach out to us, because we've been through it, and we even developed a little handbook specific to the EPA, because we had some struggles throughout it. So yeah.
Great. That sounds super helpful. Thank you. Okay, well, we are at time. I didn't see any more questions in the chat. Thank you all so much for joining and spending your time with us for this hour. Again, slides and recording will be posted on our website, so we'll make sure everybody has access to those. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.